Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. Thanks for joining in the evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. This is yet another event in the Sexuality and Political Economy stream series of historical materialism. And today we are here with Petrus Liu to talk about his relatively new book, The Specter of Materialism. Petrus is an associate professor of Chinese and comparative literature and of women's gender and sexuality studies at Boston University. He is also the author of Queer Marxism in Two Chinas and Stateless Subjects, but he's here today to talk to us about the new book, Specter of Materialism, Queer Theory and Marxism in the Age of the Beijing Consensus. I won't say much more other than that. The next event in this series will be in July. We'll be with Michelle O'Brien, Jules Gleason, and Lara Sheehy to talk about O'Brien's new book, Family Abolition. So look out for that. We'll be sending out a couple of emails with a link to register. And if you're not yet a member, a subscriber of the mailing list, I'll put a link in the chat so you can stay up to date on the activities of this stream. Okay, but that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Petrus now for a sort of 40-minute presentation, and then we'll move over to Q&A with the audience.
Great. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you all for coming here today. I'm very excited and very grateful to have this opportunity to share my work with you. And I want to thank Alex and everybody at Historical Materialism for hosting this event. Today, I'm going to be presenting my latest book, The Specter of Materialism, which was published by Duke UP earlier this year. I would like to give you a broad overview of this book's major findings and arguments in the hope of stimulating a conversation. The Specter of Materialism is a meta-theoretical project that reevaluates the developments of materialist queer theory from a new perspective centered on the political economy of post-socialist China. As you can see from the table of contents, this is also an emphatically interdisciplinary book. I divided the book into two sections, theory and history. In the theory part, I explain the book's stakes and develop my main conceptual arguments. In the second part of the book, I offer close readings of literary texts and films. My work moves between literary and culture studies, political science, economics, anthropology, and history. In the broadest terms, my aim is to generate a non-Eurocentric version of queer theory grounded in the historical experiences and collective wisdom of intellectuals outside the global north to expand the archive of references for what we recognize as theory in the humanities. My main concern in this book has to do with the so-called materialist turn that occurred within queer theory within the last decade. In recent years, queer theory appears to have made a materialist turn away from questions of representation and performativity to those of dispossession, precarity, and the differential distribution of life chances. Despite this shift, queer theory finds itself constantly reabsorbed into the liberal project of diversity management. This theoretical and political weakness, I argue, stems from an incomplete understanding of capitalism's contemporary transformations, of which China has been at the center. In this book, I challenge key premises of classic queer theory and Marxism, turning to an analysis of the Beijing Consensus, which I characterize as global capitalism's latest mutation, to develop a new theory of the political economy of sexuality. I explore how relations of gender and sexuality get reconfigured to meet the needs of capital in new regimes of accumulation and dispossession, demonstrating that evolving US-Asian economic relations shape the emergence of new queer identities and academic theories. In so doing, I offer a new history of collective struggles that provides a transnational framework for understanding the nexus between queer theory, between queerness and material life. So let me turn to my first main point about the materialist turn in queer theory. We live in a queer time when being queer itself is no longer queer enough. Academic conferences and publications clustering around questions of what is queer about queer studies now, what is left of queer after queer theory, or simply after sex on writing since queer theory, suggest either the demise of the field or a conviction in the usefulness of its remains. In the case of the latter, the consensus seems to be that whatever is left in the double sense of what is left wing and what remains of queer theory must be radicalized through re-engagement with materialist questions such as racial oppression and distributive justice. Instead of single-themed approaches to gay and lesbian history or cultures, we now find an increasing number of intersectional studies situating queerness in contexts as diverse as anti-Black racism, assisted reproductive technologies in the global South, the rise of humanitarian security regimes, crip resistance to austerity politics, and the neoliberal logic of homonationalism. By adopting a host of materialist concepts, including the neoliberal state, the maldistribution of life chances, and the global precariat, contemporary queer theory is calling for a new political optic for understanding the intersectionality of gender anti-normativity and material distribution and stratification. Though 1990s queer theory was generally perceived as the reflection of a linguistic turn in the humanities, in fact, the study of gender and sexuality has always been ineluctably haunted by materialism. Contemporary queer theory is imbued with an ever greater sense of urgency that this anti-normative project must evolve from the linguistic deconstruction of gender norms to a collective transformation of the existing systems that produce such constructions or make certain constructions count more than others in the first place. The crisis-ridden era of the post-2008 years supplied palpable evidence that progressive queer theory wants to be more materialist. Increasingly, new scholarly projects are bringing questions of political economy and the state back into a conversation that was once dominated by a hermeneutics of suspicion, crafted in the post-structuralist idioms of deconstruction and psychoanalysis. Yet, queer critics of neoliberal capitalism rarely address key Marxist concepts such as abstract labor, expanded reproduction, the organic composition of capital, the falling rate of profit, the transformation problem, or primitive accumulation. To the extent that queer theory glances worriedly at class, it conducts its anti-capitalist critique mostly through a moralizing language against privilege or discrimination. In other words, although new queer theory declares itself to be materialist, it shares more in common with mainstream progressive liberalism than Marxism. Consequently, the focus of contemporary queer theory or queer anti-capitalist analysis remains more centered on denouncing US corporate greed and reified desire, then on understanding capitalism as the transnational subsumption of labor in the global South. If we're correct to say that Marxism has remained an underutilized resource in the current critical scene of queer anti-capitalism, the revolutionary experience and Marxist theories of China's actually existing socialism, as well as the way the formerly socialist country became the world's second largest capitalist economy today, are simply forgotten. Neoliberal capitalism is a phrase that trips easily off the tongue, but without the theory of the geographical process of capital accumulation and dispossession, it has served more polemical than analytical purposes in queer theory. The year 1990 is remembered by many as the annus mirabilis of queer theory. In addition to the publication of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, David Hoperin's 100 Years of Homosexuality, and Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, 1990 also saw Teresa de Lauretis' coinage of the term queer theory as the title of a conference at UC Santa Cruz. But 1990 was also the year when a new economic relationship of mutual vassalage between America and China began to take shape, one that would eventually lead commentators to speculate in the wake of the 2007 to 10 subprime mortgage crisis that an alternative Chinese economic model called the Beijing Consensus, with this huge holdings of US government debt, productive capacity, and high savings rates, would enable the formerly socialist country to displace the United States as the center of global capitalism. In 1989, while American academics were busy finalizing the inaugural texts of what would come to be known as queer theory, the rest of the world was in revolutionary fervor. With unprecedented spontaneity and scope, the 1989 Tiananmen Square demonstrations in China sent shock waves through the socialist world that catalyzed the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. If the global capitalist order seemed temporarily stable in the mid-20th century with a mass consumption market backed up by American military hegemony, by the birth year of queer theory, it had come undone by surges of anti-systemic movements around the globe. The prolonged period of stagflation and decline in the rate of capitalist profit, which Robert Brenner identifies as having begun in 1965 to 73, induced a flexible mode of accumulation that relocated American capital to China and other low-wage sites for new rounds of expansion to counter the effects of underconsumption, rising production costs, and labor unrest. With newly established subcontracting networks, American corporations outsourced the manufacturing of low value-added products to China and transformed it into the factory of the world. It turned out, however, that China was no ordinary factory. With its huge supply of low-cost, high-quality labor, thanks to Mao-era investments in public health and mass literacy, a well-developed transportation and logistics infrastructure, a vast internal consumer market, and the technical know-how brought in by capitalists from Hong Kong and Taiwan, China quickly emerged as a core capitalist power in its own right, and is now manufacturing products of all levels of the value chain. Within a few decades since its market reforms, China became the largest single holder of US government debt, and by 2020 surpassed the United States as the world's largest recipient of foreign direct investment. In this process, China has also reinvented itself from a victim of colonialism to a neo-colonial power itself, boasting massive holdings in resource-rich countries in Africa and other parts of the global south. The Beijing Consensus represents global capitalism's latest mutation, with which materialist queer critics in North America have not yet caught up in their theorizations of the nexus of gender-based oppression. Though the case of China's post-socialist economy in the age of the Beijing Consensus, through the case study, the Specter of Materialism proposes a new theory of capital as the relentless drive to subsume and restructure relations of gender and sexuality in geopolitically segregated spaces. This book presents a history of labor struggles, as well as the reconfiguration of gendered and sexual subjects across transnational routes of accumulation and dispossession created by capital's spatial fixes. With particular attention to capital's dispossessive power, my analysis reveals dimensions of social mediation that do not lend themselves to a multiculturalist analysis of identity-based discrimination. The dilemmas and insurgencies of the Beijing Consensus have birthed new political discourses that are quite distinct from the liberal multiculturalist framework in the West. The specter of materialism is informed by new democracy theories formulated by Tiananmen dissidents, the scholarship on agrarian capitalism developed by the so-called New Left in China, Asian Marxist revisionist history of the Cold War, and queer Marxist writings associated with the Inter-Asia Culture Studies movement. The specter of materialism argues that the emergence of queer theory was not a liberal achievement, as conventional explanations of the gradual consolidation of rights-based movements and non-normative identities typically claim. Rather, it was part and parcel of crises brought about by the contradictory developments of capitalism on a global scale. As my analysis shows, US capital's accelerated relocation to China as a solution to underconsumption and rising labor costs created the conditions for China's own capitalist transformations and new inequalities. As both an economic beneficiary of late capitalism and a breeding ground for its new crises, China in the age of the Beijing Consensus has produced new forms of proletarianization and insurgency. After the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, the Chinese Communist Party under Deng Xiaoping adopted a new model of economic development designed to accelerate the accumulation of capital through the privatization of state-owned enterprises. In order to maintain competitiveness, after China's ascension to the WTO, the government sacked over 40 million workers in the SOEs and replaced them with migrant workers from rural China. Massive labor strikes arose after the smashing of the iron rice bowl expelled workers from the circuit of production in China's industrial rust belt, that is the Northeast, while migrant workers in the export-oriented Sun Belt, Guangdong, organized street protests and factory occupations against their treatment as second-class citizens. As many of the displaced and dispossessed workers are women, relegated to gender-specific sectors called 打工妹, these structural inequalities also inaugurated a renewed feminist and later queer politics that infused questions of gender and sexuality with debates about China's neoliberal experiments. While gender and sexuality-based minorities mobilize against the dispossessive logic of capital, other forms of organized resistance also enter the fray to reveal just how little consensus there is in the Beijing Consensus. Despite the Chinese state's aggressive promoting of nationalism to fill the ideological vacuum left by the discrediting of Maoism, the Chinese dream of the Xi Jinping era has failed to mask Beijing's exploitative and oppressive policies towards its various Souths, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Though diverse in causes, anti-systemic movements in Hong Kong and Taiwan, from the 2014 umbrella and sunflower movements to the 2019 to 2020 anti-extradition law amendment bill movement, reveal social antagonisms that cannot be easily assimilated into China's harmonious growth, harmonious society growth narrative. This punctuated history indicates that China's reintegration into the capitalist world economy is anything but a smooth or homogeneous process. Instead, it requires the subsumption or reordering of social relations, including gendered, sexual, racialized, and ethnic, that are outside of capital value production, as well as geographical spaces at the edge of capitalist formation that are excluded from generalized commodity circulation, such as China's agrarian hinterlands and the extractive industries in Africa. With the introduction of the household responsibility system under the market reform of 1978, the peasants in China retained the use rights of the land, but its ownership was nominally transferred to the rural collective. This unique tenure system continues to be the key to China's claim to being a socialist country today, despite its agrarian capitalism, namely the financialization of rural land through paid lease and transfer of use rights. China's agrarian capitalism embodies the contradiction between Mao's promise of the land tenure system and the current PRC state's effort to modernize the rural economy by injecting capital into the agricultural sector as a solution to problems caused by China's overall transformation into an export-oriented economy. Driven by the imperatives of capital accumulation, new rural land reform policies created large business conglomerates and a linked banking system to channel rural savings to the urban centers. As financial capital began to be infused into the agricultural hinterlands, state migration policies based on a two-tier hukou, that is, household registration system, became more relaxed in 1984. After losing land rights to large agribusiness companies in the new socialist countryside, dispossessed peasants became China's floating populations, or liuming, which are migrant workers streaming into large cities, seeking employment in precarious conditions. Indeed, the China boom is financed by two mechanisms of capital accumulation: the commodification of rural land and the financialization of rural land. Scholars estimate that China's economic success in the past 4 decades has been powered by the labor of 287 million rural migrant workers who travel seasonally, because of the hukou system prevents them from settling in the urban centers, effectively creating a form of social apartheid. This system of precarious and contingent employment gives China a low-cost competitive advantage in the global capitalist economy, while allowing rural lands to be expropriated at low costs and auctioned to urban real estate developers. China's expansion into Africa is another key example in my analysis of capitalism as transnational value extraction. In the 21st century, China has become the largest bilateral lender for public sector loans across the African continent. Though met with mixed feelings, China as donor and development partner appeared particularly credible to African leaders because of China's own history, recent history as a late industrializing country, its success in poverty reduction programs, and its own experience as a recipient of foreign aid. From 2009 to 2012, China provided 10 billion USD to Africa in the form of concessional loans. During President Xi Jinping's first overseas trip to Africa in March 2013, he doubled this commitment to 20 billion USD over the next 2 years. A particularly controversial practice, which came to be known as the Angola model because it began with a 2004 low-interest $2 billion loan to Angola, allowed African countries to use their commodities, oil reserves, or other natural resources as collateral for Chinese loans. Thanks to these deals, China surpassed the US as Africa's largest trade partner in 2009, and by 2016, it had established itself as the continent's largest single investor. Though cooperation between China and countries in the Global South has existed since the 1955 Bandung Conference, South cooperation, or SSC, estimated to exceed 20 billion in worth, has become the signature element of contemporary China's economic growth and global diplomacy. With the creation of South cooperation as an alternative to traditional development assistance programs, China entered a new era that Xi Jinping officially anointed as China's going out policy. If during the Bandung era, the relationship between China, Africa, and Latin America was primarily imagined as a form of anti-imperialist solidarity and tricontinentalism, China, in the age of the Beijing Consensus, is using the rhetoric of South-South cooperation to construct a very different kind of geopolitical order. To many commentators outside the PRC, China's current interest in the Global South is largely driven by neocolonial ventures and investments, representing a new scramble for Africa to make it Beijing's second continent. The Global South is no longer the former Third World, of which China once imagined itself to be part, but a new frontier to explore, conquer, and assimilate. Under this regime of surplus extraction, new forms of South-South racializations come into being. From the Chinese state's own perspective, however, these economic activities fulfill two main goals. First, to counteract the legacy of China's isolation and delinking from the world economy during the Maoist era. Second, to create a multipolar world order with a focus on South-South cooperation as an alternative to the Washington Consensus rooted in the neoliberal doctrine championed by Thatcher and Reagan. Introduced in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative is perhaps the most ambitious element of China's going out policy, a form of state-mobilized globalization that involves infrastructure development in over 70 countries in Europe, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. The concept of the Beijing Consensus names the complex debates about China's relations to the Global South, whether China offers an alternative model of capitalist development to the Washington Consensus, or is actually a neocolonial power in disguise that uses debt trap diplomacy to expand its soft power and secure mining rights in the global south. As I mentioned earlier, female migrant workers now constitute a primary example of the indispensably disposable workplace in China's post-socialist modernization, providing an inexhaustible reserve army of labor that accelerates capitalist development by contributing to an overall depression of wages and keeping labor costs in China internationally competitive. China's post-socialist development is a clear demonstration that capital accumulation requires and produces differentiated populations. The vulnerability of women as a group is amplified by China's neoliberal transformations. Concentrated in China's export-oriented region, Dagome experience a particular form of precarity in that they're at once relegated to feminized labor and considered radically substitutable and expendable. Despite their structural position as second-class citizens in the global workplace, Dagome are routinely deprived of the capacity to articulate class consciousness. The emergence of Dagome as a gendered class is part of a broader transformation of pre-existing livelihoods and social ties that were once based on China's unique kin-based networks, culture of lineage consciousness, and gender-based hierarchies. In addition to Dagome, another particularly instructive example of how the financialization of rural land transformed gender relations is the population known as money boys in China. Money boys are rural to urban migrant workers who enter the sex industry in search of a new means of subsistence after the collapse of socialist institutions. Dispossessed, displaced, and having literally nothing to sell except their bodies, which are often seen as lean, naturally fit, and thus desirable by white-collar gay men holding office jobs in the information economy, rural sex workers perform a new kind of proletarianized labor. Money boys are not necessarily oppressed or exploited, and they're certainly not trafficked. Rather, it is more accurate to say that they embody the contradictions of China's agrarian capitalism without surrendering their agency. The rise of commodified male same-sex sexual labor forms an important aspect of China's pink capitalism, which has created a significant expansion of queer public spaces, including parks, bars, clubs, community centers, and most importantly, social networking mobile applications that make these encounters possible. But as is the case with other instances of formal subsumption, the economic incorporation of money boys' labor does not entail their social integration, and new hierarchies ensued. Rooted in the contradiction between differentially valued rural and urban labor, the discourse of quality or 素质 has gained prominence in Chinese debates about class respectability in the post-reform era. 素质 discourse is an important technology of neoliberal governmentality in China today, whose real aim is to rationalize the post-socialist state's expropriation of rural land as the government's effort to improve the cultural upbringing of peasants. The influx of sex workers into urban centers changed the parlance of middle-class gay men who are now using the term money boys to differentiate themselves anxiously and emphatically from those deemed incapable of the proper embodiment of desire. Money boys' queer labor constitutes an under-theorized dimension of the new politics of human value in China today, one that transforms the material struggles of minority minoritized subjects of gender and sexuality into the production of higher quality selves for global capitalism. This new monograph builds on my 2015 book, Queer Marxism in Two Chinas. In both works, I strive to situate queer survival and persistence within the contradictions between the mobility of transnational capital and the immobility of human labor. This theme has become a primary political and theoretical task for me. While capitalist production has become rationalized and globalized, our regime of accountability has not. What is unevenly distributed is not just our vulnerability, but also our sense of proximity, that is, whose lives matter, whose lives are worth protection and recognition, and who belongs to this collective us versus them. Bodies come together sometimes erratically across borders, but bodies are also laboring and producing used values that we consume, living in relation to hierarchies that we create, and thinking in differentially valued traditions and languages. Queer bodies exist in a state of constant tension with the instruments of capital accumulation, including a citizenship system that confers legal rights based on birth accidents and monogamous marriages, an institution of private property enshrined in idealized forms of kinship and descent, the reproduction of families as neoliberal consumers, and racially segregated access to healthcare, housing, and means of subsistence. To be queer, to inhabit a queer body, means that one must rebel against capitalism's loss of value and their regulation of gender and sexual norms, shifting the question from queer theory's applicability to non-Western societies to what we can learn from their historical experiences. We can begin to reconceptualize US-based queer theory as a minority participant in a multilingual conversation. Instead of thinking of non-European sexual subjects as underrepresented victims in need of search and rescue, I turn to them as differentially or differently situated knowledge producers in the history of the uneven accumulation of capital. While my own work is certainly not truly global in scope, I hope that this book's arguments and findings, no matter how exploratory and provisional they may seem at times, will expand our archive of references for a global queer Marxism that has yet to be born. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Petrus. That was excellent. Okay, so now we have time for questions or comments or discussion. So if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself, and then we can put it to Petrus. I might start off while people are thinking of questions. So one concept or frame that is very central in the book, but maybe didn't come out as much in the presentation, was subsumption. And you talk about formal and real subsumption in the introduction quite a lot in relation to the immediate production process. Then you also use it in perhaps a less sort of strictly spoken Marxist way to talk about, for example, the subsumption of the Cold War later on. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what subsumption does for you in the book?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Yeah, subsumption is a key operative word in my analysis, and I thank you, Alex. I think I should have explained it better in the presentation as well. first of all, I make it a point in the book, to actually go back to Marx's Capital, because, I feel like, there's a lot of Marxist analysis nowadays, Marxist cultural criticism provided by people who don't actually read Marx. And, I want to make a case for the value of a critical return to reading Marx, especially the, Capital, as a foundational text, and trying to work out some of its complexities and thinking about how that literature can actually shed light on contemporary debates. Now, so within the Marxist literature, there is a vast body of literature on what subsumption means. Some people, read Marx's distinction between formal and real subsumption as relating to different stages of development in global capitalism. I use the term to describe the process whereby capital reorganizes relations that appear to be extra economic or exterior to the moment of capital reproduction. So critical to my theory is the idea that capitalism is not just an economic formation, but something that requires and produces the differentiation of human populations in hierarchical ways. And in its quest to produce even more value. And that relationship where capital meets a set of social relations that appear to be outside of the economic realm, is what I'm describing using the Marxist vocabulary as a moment of subsumption. I think there probably.
Yes, Grisha.
Hi. Sorry about the low light here. It's thanks so much, Petrus, for that really interesting talk. I read your book when it came out a few years ago, and it's really been helpful to see it get kind of a second airing and having you summarize it or discuss it so coherently has really helped me understand it. You spoke about the way that capital configures sexuality in order to serve the needs of capital. I wondered if you could say a bit more about gender and what, if anything, has changed in the recent sort of political, economic changes you've described in China with regards to gender and gender diversity, if anything.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I was really glad to hear. In the final chapter of my book, I go into a lot of detail about the debate about gender and sexuality in China. Now, so before I can talk about it, I want to say that gender is one of those terms that might mean something quite different for everybody, right? So in the book, I talk about how the term gender has been translated differently into Chinese, and there was a very interesting debate that emerged when people tried to translate various kinds of Western feminisms into China. And some people argued that, well, we don't need Western feminism at all. We don't need this concept of gender because, China has its own, what Western feminists are talking about have no relevance to Chinese reality, or maybe, the Chinese tradition and the Chinese language is superior. And other people find value in thinking with Western feminists what gender might mean, what this kind of vocabulary and analytic might open up in terms of social inquiry and political advocacy, and yet disagreed on the best way to translate the distinction between gender and sex. In my book, I talk about that the reason why gender in all of those alternatives, has become kind of reified and treated as a synonym for women. Whereas gender for me, is a term that could refer quite flexibly to questions such as including gender identity, right, and your gender presentation and your gender characteristics. Gender can be seen as a positive identity that people choose for themselves. Some people can't live without their gender. Some people find gender to be inherently oppressive. It is for people who hold such views, there is no such thing as a positive concept of gender. Rather, some people argue that, the only way, we can really be emancipated is to create a truly genderless society. So there are, I think, the term gender is incredibly complex and interesting. And I was very interested in that moment when all of those complexities were flattened out and very, facilely, collapsed into a singular understanding of gender as a synonym for women. And womanhood, as a singular kind of identity that can be attributed to a particular sociological population at the expense of other possibilities, and so on and so forth. So, I think the study of China is an opportunity for us to think about how gender as a term and as a critical expression, can be given a kind of historicity, right? Because every society has a different kind of historical relation to this term and has a different way of articulating what that society may believe or allow to be understood as gender.
Great. Any other questions or comments or observations? I think, okay. I think Bruno in the chat is saying that they were wondering if you could talk a bit more about the relation, if there is any, between the framework presented in the book and recent articulations of social reproduction theory. Oh, that's interesting.
Wow. That's, yeah. That's great. That's a huge question, though. I think in my book, I kind of avoided invoking social reproduction theory explicitly, precisely because I think that field is enormously complex and rich and dynamic, and I personally felt like I was probably taking on too much. I also wanted to think as rigorously as I can about Marxian economics, which has its own kind of tradition and debates. I recently came across a new work on in trans Marxism, and it's about social non-reproduction theory, which also makes sense if you think about it. But all of that is to say that I haven't quite decided how I want to situate my work to recent debates in social reproduction theory. Although I find of course that school of thought to be incredibly important and valuable.
Further questions?
I will. I'll let you know after the event. Yeah.
Yes, Tulio.
Hi, Petrus. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I wanted to hear more about, because I know in the book you compare the creation, arguments on the creation of the homosexual identity or gay identity in industrial societies in the West. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the difference now that you present in your book with the creation of the new gendered categories of subjects or humans, such as the dangome in China. What is like the difference that you are proposing in terms of those capital process of transformation of countries and societies and urban environments and the creation of differentiated gendered humans?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah. So I think first, I should mention that in China studies, there is a lot of people, argue that because, as we know from reading Foucault and Foucauldian scholars, that homosexuality was a historical invention, that China must have had its own kind of epistemic rupture that was parallel to the invention of homosexuality in the West, and or perhaps not, right? It's a very controversial topic, but I think the mainstream view is that the category of Hongzhi in China is not commensurable with the category of gay and lesbian described in the Anglophone sense, and that is because China has its own history of homoeroticism, homoerotic richness, and to collapse the distinction between Chinese organizations of desire and same-sex intimacy, as an extension of U.S. style sexual politics, is to fall victim to a kind of cultural imperialism and so on and so forth. So most people are looking for examples of gender variance that can be invoked or mobilized, as resistance to the universalizing pretensions of homosexuality as we understood it, or what people following Foucault, and the speciation argument, that the homosexual was a species, right? Whereas the sodomite was a temporary aberration, according to Foucault. So I wanted to say just from the start that my own work does not actually follow that particular view, which is generally accepted by scholars working on China and or Sinophone societies. I want to think of queer in a more expansive way, not as an identity category, not as a synonym for or an umbrella term for LGBTQ+, but rather as a category that is constantly renegotiated and expanded and revised by other social currents. So in the book, I talk about queerness as a critical position, as a position of criticality, as a position that is radically anticipatory, rather than something that has already been born or has already been established as the position of the unthought. And because of that, I'm interested in these emerging categories that are the categories that may or may not have an official name, may or may not have already entered discourse, or given form to modes of political mobilization. I talk about sex workers and money boys, right? I also talk about female migrant workers or dagome as examples of queer kinship, as examples of how relations of gender and sexuality are constantly being renegotiated and reconfigured and in flux, in fact. And these changes, I argue, have everything to do with China's capitalist transformations. And conversely, you can't really understand what capitalism is or what capitalism does without attending to such differences. So that's more or less, the framework that I'm working with or developing in, and the reason why I propose, dagome as a potentially queer category for an expanded kind of a materialist analysis here.
Great. Any other questions?
Or comments are also welcome. It doesn't have to be a question.
Hey, I have a question. So I was wondering if you're doing anything in your book with the concept of the individual or individualism, individuation. Because it seems that one of the sort of underpinnings of the liberal multiculturalists is, the rights of the individual and how that overlays onto your argument.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, especially for people working in China, because as I was kind of alluding to earlier, there is a widely accepted theory that the Chinese category of sexual difference, which is 同志, cannot be translated into, cannot be equated with gay or queer in the Western sense. And for those who make that argument, a lot of them are, informed by an influential study of Zhou Huashan back in the 1990s, who made this argument because he said that the basic sociological unit of the Chinese, of Chinese society is the family and not the individual. So the reason why 同志 cannot be gay is precisely that Chinese society is organized by families rather than individuals. Right? So of course, one could easily, dismiss that kind of argument as essentializing, and the whole debate about, whether coming out is, a useful strategy, for China, and what about, the widespread phenomenon of some people, translated as sham family or convenience marriage, which is, a very common practice of gay men, marrying either an unsuspecting, heterosexual woman or a lesbian, in order to, save face for the family, or perhaps, to procreate. For whatever reason, yes, I mean, sociologically, one could say a lot about the forces of familialism in China, and one could also talk about China as an authoritarian country, as a country that has a history of collectivism, collective mobilization, and how the contemporary moment of neoliberal transformation has inaugurated perhaps a new kind of subject that is more akin to what we recognize, as the foundation of Western liberalism and possessive individualism. So I think these arguments and analyses can be done. In my own book, I don't tackle these questions too directly, but I do have a chapter where I talk about the shadows of the Cold War. And I talk about how it was during the Cold War that a particular narrative about what communism has done to Chinese, traditional Chinese culture and to China, has become kind of naturalized. And even though we would like to believe that we're, now officially in the post-Cold War era, we're actually haunted by that particular structure of feeling, which has simply translated and transmuted into a different kind of idiom of independence versus unification, for example. And I analyze how that kind of rhetoric works in contemporary film and fiction and political discourses. So it's not an argument against individualism per se, but rather it is an exercise, if you will, an analysis of how a certain language of individualism actually can be traced to an earlier moment of history where the political contradiction, had yet to be resolved.
We have a comment from Alexander Liebman in the chat that I'll read out, just for the recording mostly. Alexander says, I'm really excited about your thinking with and beyond agrarian studies to theorize queerness and gender sex transformations. This seems like an intellectual and academic space that needs a lot of work. From where I work, Colombia, still basically grounded in campesino women and uncritical look at the household. Alexander is wondering how you are thinking about this intervention, expanding or challenging agrarian studies, and or if you have found any interlocutors with or in agrarian space to think radical notions of queerness.
Thank you. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm always, really excited about, chances like this to learn about parallel work that other scholars are undertaking in different, geographical locations and working with different historical archives. And, I'm really glad to see that, the kind of thinking that I'm pushing, sometimes, resonates with people and can lead to, these, surprising alliances and discoveries. So I think my work, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is emphatically interdisciplinary, or could even say promiscuous. Right? So I'm bringing together a lot of different conversations and different types of scholarship offered by people who are not talking to each other, for sure. That is not to say that I'm reinventing the wheel. The work agrarian capitalism in China, I learned from professionally trained scholars who have done way more research, empirical studies on this topic than I could ever possibly do myself in a lifetime. And I have endless admiration for the scholars who came before me and have taught me everything that I wanted to know and more about these topics. It is true that they are not thinking about queerness, but some of them have been reading my work and have responded very generously to the kind of analysis that I'm proposing. So I would like to think that that it is through this kind of conversation that the boundaries have begun to be loosened up a little bit, and people are always learning from each other and standing on each other's shoulders. The example that I mentioned a lot in my presentation today, Dagomei, for example, that was not, I don't claim originality to that, right? That's actually a huge research topic in Chinese sociology. Other people have written about money boys and as far as I know, though, I mean, money boys, are a different story, but Dagome, has never really been, discussed as an example of queerness for sure. But the literature on agrarian studies is generally, I think people are interested in questions of gender and sexuality, but they are not probably thinking about gender and sexuality in the same way that we are more used to, and that is why more conversations like this are always extremely helpful.
Yes, we have one question. Sarong?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Petrus, for this really wonderful and very inspiring and also seductive presentation. I'm yet to read the book, but I would like to ask you a kind of a methodological question and a bigger question. So two questions. Well, you mentioned the Dagome and Money Boy. What kind of methodology you use to make the study of these communities? And together with that question is, of course, there is a value in thinking about queerness in Dagome community, but is there also a risk of some like a kind of colonizing gesture of calling things that are not necessarily queer, right? So I don't know how to frame that question in a more nuanced way, but I guess you get what I'm getting at, right? So the question of nomenclature. The bigger question is kind of the question of the post-socialist. In recent years, I feel this is really a intuition. The kind of official narrative is pushing towards some kind of post-capitalist, leaning to some kind of argument of socialism. Whether it is practiced as such or not is a separate question, right? But discursively, it is kind of pushing towards de-Westernization, deliberalization, let's say maybe also post-capitalist. So how do you I guess that's a question of how do you think of the moment and forward? What is this going? What is this Beijing Consensus that is caught in this combination of nationalist, extremely nationalist discourse and a attempt to like delinking or relinking and so on. I was in China in past 3 years, being locked in basically. So yeah, that's the kind of general direction. Yeah, I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. These were excellent questions. So first, I think I will answer by making 3 points. The first question, was about methodology. I would just say that Dagome and Money Boys are examples. They are not meant to be exhaustive, right? They don't describe everything. It was not my intention to provide a comprehensive list of gender categories in China today, or categories that that emerged discursively and politically because of China's post-socialist transformations or integration into the global capitalist system. In the book, I offer many other examples that I didn't include in the presentation. So the overall point that I'm trying to make is that one cannot understand capitalism purely, exclusively as an economic formation. And I think that, the literature on Dagome and Money Boys is incredibly rich and illustrative and quite accessible, actually, right? There are a lot of people working on those topics that I can depend on to make a persuasive case for how China's capitalist transformations have actually produced reconfigured relations of gender and sexuality, and conversely, that it was through the subjugation and the production of new gendered relations that capitalism became possible and sustainable. So, are there other examples? Yes, of course, right? But I think these are among the clearest and most compelling ones that I can find and discuss in a telegraphic fashion for the presentation's sake. Your second point about whether it is about the ethics, right? About whether it is potentially colonizing to claim a non-queer subject as queer. I think to answer that, we should recognize that there are people who say that to work on, to apply queer theory to China at all is a form of colonial violence, because, queer, as I mentioned, was a term, coined at a US conference in 1990, right? So, so there are people who were resistant, who don't like it at all, when we talk about anything Chinese under the rubric of queer. Okay, so I'm not saying that that's your position, of course, and I know it's not, right? But we could easily imagine, a more extreme kind of version of the critique, which is to reject everything. But my answer to that has always been that I'm not trying to work out the question of the cross-cultural applicability of the term queer. Rather, I'm trying to think about how the term queer can be expanded by way of considering a non-Western example. Right? So it's not that I am borrowing a Western category and imposing it on a Chinese experience, but rather I'm actually thinking about how that category itself has to be expanded and augmented and revised by experiences that it did not consider at the moment of its genesis, right? So I would say the same thing about the question or critique of Dagome as well, right? So it's not that I am imposing a category of queer which is based on centered on the experience of homosexuality and then claiming that a kind of universality to that category, but rather I'm thinking about how that category itself ought to be complicated in relation to social categories and experiences that constitutively may have has not been considered to be central to its formation. Okay, and the last question about post-capitalism in China today and the rise of ultra-nationalist discourses. I think there's nothing really new about that. China has always been eager to distinguish itself from the West in every way possible, even when it was trying to learn from or appropriate from the West, right? So, back in the late Qing period, you had people, offering ideas about Western learning as the application, Chinese learning as the essence, that kind of theory. And then, then you have, Marxism, or Leninism, with Chinese characteristics. And then you have a story about how China has created a market society that is still socialist, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea that the Chinese, or China, has created something altogether, that is distinct from whatever Western model is trying to emulate, that kind of discourse itself is not new. What I would say, though, is that we need to distinguish between capitalism as a state ideology and capitalism as a system, right? So for the record, I'm more interested in the latter, right? I'm interested in thinking about capitalism as a totality, as a system that governs, produces forms of social life and mediation, and the differential kind of combined and uneven developments of nations that are including nations that claim to be socialist or outside that particular system. So I'm not talking about capitalism as a state ideology or a state doctrine or a economic policy that one can pick and choose, from a menu of possibilities. Today we're capitalists, tomorrow we're not. And that's not the kind of capitalism that we're interested in, analyzing here at Historical Materialism, I think. I think, we're interested in a broader kind of, formation that is global in scale and that would actually govern the relations, not just the internal kind of, relations of forces and relations of production within a national polity, but rather, something that between the relationality between China and other members of the family of nations as well, right? So, if you're working with that definition of capitalism, then you wouldn't take too seriously about, China's, or I wouldn't even say that China as a country, but particular members, of Chinese society are claiming that China is now transcending capitalism.
Thank you. That was especially the second question was a very selfish question of for my own sake, but thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Here we have another question from who?
Hi, Petrus. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really thought-provoking. And I'm just to build on to the previous discussion on Dagongmei. So I think for those new queer figures like Dagongmei and Moneyboy, right? I think their agency for presenting a new queer social imaginary is quite different from those very active participants of queer movements because they are quite unconscious of their role in local queer politics. So I'm wondering if the emergence of these new queer figures somehow queer the methods of engagement and participation in the queer world-making process, which seems especially important under heightened management of queer life in China. So I wanted to know what you think about this unconscious participation or the participation of unconscious subjects in this process of social reconfiguration. Do you think it's like a very important new modality that China can offer to queer theory potentially?
Thank you so much. That was such a great question. So
Thank
smart.
you.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Okay. So it just, while I was listening to your, incredibly well-formulated question, I was thinking that I didn't really formulate a theory or an account of queer subjectivity here. And I do think that it is important to distinguish between these categories and subject positions that I'm describing as queer, but as you say, who are not consciously participating in queer engagement and world making. I need to distinguish between those subjects and the ones who are, right? The ones who are, claiming a space and a positionality and a subject position in the world precisely because of their queerness in a self-affirmative way, because these people do exist, right? As we know, right? And they're doing very important work. And to that question, we should also think about the fact that queerness is increasingly commodified in every part of the world. I think I did mention very briefly pink capitalism in my presentation. This is something that I wrote about more in my second book, not this one. And was talking about the emergence of queer liberalism and commodified queer public spaces in China, and how with the institutionalization of queer thinking and space, festivals and pride parades and all kinds of BL films, that we can find in the media. Again, is there anything queer about queerness today? And is the phenomenon that has been critiqued, amply, in the West, is the same phenomenon happening in China as well? And if so, what exactly is the relationship between the categories that I'm claiming as relevant to queer subjectivity, but are not quite yet queer, right? And then the subconsciously queer ones, and then you also have activists and grassroots movements in China, which are not the same, right? As the commodified homonormative expressions or expressions of homo nationalism in China. So what exactly is the relationship between these? We might tentatively say, three different levels of instances of queer expressions in China. And then your second half of your comment / question had to do with whether I think the analysis of China can serve as a model or modality for Western analysis. I would say absolutely yes, but not in the sense of not in the sense that what is happening in China is that has the status of the truth, right? With a capital T, but rather that queer analysis has to learn from the experiences and struggles of different subjects across the world, because we're all because the moment that we're in is interconnected, right? We're both intimate and alienated from one another at the same time, and that impossibly intimate and alienated relationality between self and other is precisely the product of capitalism. So I think that to do queer theory in relation to and in the context of globalization is incredibly empowering and useful, actually.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Well, this has been a really great discussion. Do we have any Any final questions or comments? In that case, thank you again so much, Petrus. It's been
Yeah.
wonderful. And thank you all for joining and for your questions. I hope to see you all at some of the forthcoming events.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining me today. And thank you, Alex.